afternoon, Eric. My name's Jay Waters. I'm with the Voices of Freedom Project. Today is Saturday, 26th of August, 2023. We're out here in Nokesville, Virginia at our annual open house at the tank farm. But Eric, if you would, just for the record, give us your full name and where you were born.
Eric O'Neill. I was actually born in Iowa, town of Council Bluffs.
Council Bluffs, Iowa, right on the river.
You got it. You got it.
And, Eric,
almost a Nebraskan, but
yep,
not quite.
Right, there's that bridge that goes
you got it.
over into Omaha, as I recall.
Yep.
And Eric, how old are you now?
I'm 50 years old.
Okay. And what war or conflict did you participate in?
So I was deployed over to Somalia and Mogadishu in Africa back in 93, 94.
And what branch of service?
U.S. Army.
And thinking about your family, like your dad or grandparents, brothers, sisters, uncles, do you have other family members that had served in the military before you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my dad was a Navy vet. My uncle was a Navy vet. My other uncle was an Air Force vet. So, you know, the service was kind of a family thing as well.
Yeah, a long line of service, a lot of Navy, and then you joined the Army.
Yep,
so.
yep.
Well, so then, thinking about that, why did you join the military?
So my biggest thing at the time was, you know, just kind of seeing what was going on. You know, when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, of course, Desert Storm kind of kicked off. And the Army had really always been kind of an interest to me. And I wanted to fly helicopters. And when Desert Storm and all that kicked off, obviously we got to watch that on TV, kind of live as it happened, right? And that was really the first time that really became a thing. And that pretty much to me kind of solidified. I wanted to go in, I wanted to serve, and you know, having veterans in my family and understanding the meaning of service, that, you know, it fit the bill for me very well.
Okay. Well, and let me just back up for a second too, kind of related to that joining, although this was after. So think about the attack on America, September 11th in 2001. Where were you that day and what was going on, and just kind of tell us about that experience.
Yeah, sure. So as pretty much everybody can remember where they were, I was in kind of a unique position. So in the Army, I worked in military helicopters. So I was in the aviation industry at the time. I'd actually started with a couple friends in aviation company. So fast forward to September 2001, was in the middle of doing some aviation contracts. And I had just gotten home. I was between contracts at the time, just gotten home, and was you know, pretty much relaxing. And my father-in-law came in and told me, "Hey, you need to go watch the news." So that was after the first plane had hit. He didn't know anything. Really, nobody knew anything. You know, they were talking about small planes and stuff like that. When I saw the hole in the towers, I knew that wasn't a small plane. Having been in the aviation industry, and then of course watched the rest of the day.
Right. And
my first response to my wife was, I got to find a new career, because my business was basically done, being a new startup business, trying to keep going when a lot of planes are grounded, and I had, you know, a lot of things going on at that time with some long-term potential that got immediately cut off because, you know, companies were losing money. So September 11th rolled around. I'd been out of the military for a few years, but my wife and I discussed it and we're like, I'm going back in. I'm going back in.
And where were you living at the time?
So I was living in Bryan, Texas at the time.
Okay. Yeah.
So, you know, down by Texas A&M University. Yeah. So I, you know, went to the recruiter and talked to them about getting back in, and, you know, because of my disability and because of my situation, it wasn't something they were even allowing me to do. So I continued to work defense contracting.
Okay, well, you tried.
I could support any way I can, right?
Yeah. Well, so I'm kind of jumping around, but that's intentional here. So you joined shortly after high school?
Yeah, so I joined, so graduated from high school in 91. Actually had an ROTC scholarship, so I went to college for a year on an ROTC scholarship and decided that the only thing I liked about college was ROTC. So I decided I'm just going to go ahead and enlist in the military. Enlisted in 92.
Okay.
And, you know, basically October 1 of 92, beginning of the fiscal year, is when I started my military service.
And did you get that helicopter maintenance job?
So I did. I got to work on, I got trained to work on Cobra helicopters, which is, in my opinion, the best helicopter on the planet. But I also got to work on Apache helicopters. And then basically from that experience in the military, when I was in defense contracting, I basically worked on every helicopter that the military owns. Okay. So I've worked on Chinook helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters, Little Bird helicopters,
yeah.
You name it. So
you probably saw we got a big shirt
yep,
out there.
I did.
So check that out.
Yep.
Sure, if you haven't already. Well, so where did you go for your basic and any specialized training?
Yeah, so basic, I was Fort Jackson, South Carolina, home of the fire ants. Got introduced to the fire ants down there. I'm from Iowa, so we don't have the fire ant problem there. After basic training, went to Fort Eustis, Virginia, and spent 9 months there in AIT, doing helicopter armament, weapons systems, and missile repair. So basically, I was an armament guy on the Cobra helicopters.
And then after AIT, where did you send?
After AIT, my first duty station was Fort Hood, Texas. So I got to Fort Hood in May. It was actually right around Memorial Day of 90, what had that been, 93? 93. And then my unit was actually in transition from Fort Polk to Fort Hood. So Fort Polk, Louisiana was where they were housed. They were packing up everything to including the helicopters and getting them ready to transport everything up to Fort Hood. So when I went to Fort Hood, I was actually attached to a transportation unit because they needed a home for me until my unit got there. As my unit started to roll in, I got moved down to Fort Polk to help close out and get all the aircraft maintained and help get everything ready and moved up. So everything got moved and transitioned around September of 93. And then it was actually me and a good friend of mine, Nathan. He and I were actually in basic training together. So basic training, AIT, and permanent duty. So, he and I were friends. We were on our temporary duty down to Fort Polk while our unit was up in Fort Hood now. Yeah. And we ended up getting stuck down there for like 3 months. Wow. Because of, quite honestly, I think we got forgotten about. But during that timeline is when the Black Hawk Down incident happened. And a lot of that got covered in the news media and them taking soldiers and dragging them through the street and things yes. of that nature. So at the time, being trained on Cobra helicopters and understanding there were Cobra helicopters in service in Somalia, I went to my first sergeant and said, look, Fort Polk is killing me. I'm not doing anything here. I'm not really working on helicopters. Do whatever you can to send me over there. He said, well, be careful what you ask for. And turned around shortly thereafter, was getting ready to go on leave for vacation for Christmas to go see my family. And first sergeant said, yeah, you're not going anywhere. Your wish has come true. You're heading over to Africa. So
this would have been like, what, December of 93?
December of 93, yeah.
But now, and again, I'm not going to say the worst or the best, but the bigger incidents had already occurred, right? Like October?
Correct. So, yeah, Black Hawk Down, that incident, and really the whole situation in itself had really kind of peaked, I'll say, in that October time frame. After that, it was really, truly a transition of, still kind of overseeing some of the humanitarian efforts that were going on in Somalia at that time. And initially it was, you're going to go over there for 6 months, while we transition out. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, shortly after we got there, they started talking about sending us home. So that transition happened a lot quicker.
So hold that thought for a second, but just for somebody, and even for myself, I'm a 30-year Army guy, but what was the mechanics to get you from either Fort Hood or Fort Polk to Somalia?
Yeah, so that was a little crazy. So being in Fort Polk on TDY from our unit in Fort Hood, there was a unit out of Fort Carson, Colorado that was heading over to basically replace the 10th Mountain Group out of Fort Drum. who were the Cobra guys. And so the group from Fort Carson had requested some Cobra guys from Fort Hood, from our unit, because they only had one. All the rest of the guys were Apache guys, because Cobra guys weren't trained anymore.
Yeah.
The AIT actually quit training on Cobras and automatically pushed you into the Apache training program at that time. So they reached out, and we ended up getting attached to a unit from Fort Carson. So we got...
Was that the 4-4 Aviation?
Yep. Well, so the... I couldn't remember exactly, but I think it's 4-4 Aviation. Okay. Ironically, 4th ID out of Fort Carson eventually replaced my unit in Fort Hood, so it became crazy. Yeah, it became a real mess on all that. But at the time, I was actually in the 502nd Aviation Regiment with 2nd Armored Division when Hell on Wheels still existed.
Yes.
So I was still in Patton's Army. So got attached to the unit from Fort Carson. We actually flew civilian from Fort Carson, Colorado to Bangor, Maine. Bangor, Maine to Mombasa, Kenya. We arrived in Mombasa, Kenya at about 3 o'clock in the morning. I remember it very vividly because it was pitch black, of course, middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. It was about 93 degrees and 100% humidity. And, you know, I can't remember, end of December, first part of January. It was middle of winter in Colorado to just thick air in Kenya.
Uniform and all your gear at this
Yep.
point?
Yep. So carrying, you know, not only carrying gear, you know, we had, you know, body armor and all of that, but carrying the duffel bag full of all the extra stuff. I've been deployed to Iraq as a civilian contractor. I'll say they have cushy deployment just because I like to make fun, because back in that, you know, in Somalia, it was, here's your cot, here's your mosquito net, enjoy. That's deployment life.
And how'd you go from Mombasa up to your next?
Yeah, so once we landed in Mombasa, we ended up basically walking across the airfield, loaded up onto a C-130, and flew in just above the water into Mogadishu, primarily because there was no civilian traffic because of anti-aircraft weapons that the folks in Somalia were alleged to have happened upon. So we came in on a C-130, which was pretty cool for me. That was my first military aircraft non-helicopter event.
Well, that's true. Helicopter,
right. You know, so, you know, cruising along just above the ocean was pretty cool. And then, you know, coming in and landing there, seeing, you know, really looking around at the airfield, seeing the tent city, which was small because Somalia wasn't really a large deployment. You know, so we had our tents, we had our shower unit, we had the hangar there, which primarily where a lot of the efforts were really taking place. Yeah. At that time, it was really just the Eyes Over Mogadishu mission. It was just keeping an eye on what's going on, because a lot of, you know, like we were talking about a little bit ago, a lot of the real interaction had kind of faded back, and it was really just a protective of the humanitarian mission that was going on, food and water.
But that was the name of the mission, Eyes Over Mogadishu.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. And so, like, just tell us, like, your typical day. What were your duties? What were you doing?
Yeah, so for a typical day, we were doing just maintenance on Cobra helicopters. Occasionally, we would run out and have to, you know, load up rocket pods and load up guns for the weapon systems, because they were running their scouts and they needed to be, you know, armed and all that in case they needed to react. But for the most part, it was just doing the maintenance on the helicopters and making sure that mission was still able to be achieved from the eyes over. Generally speaking, for the most part, it was really an uneventful kind of thing. You know, obviously you had you know, range days where they would go out and practice, and they actually had targets on the Indian Ocean and all that, where they would fly out, do a little bit of practicing.
Did you go with those guys?
No, no. So when they're running their missions, Cobra's only a 2-seater spot, so you've got the pilot and the gunner. So unless you're lucky, you can't really talk a pilot into letting some enlisted guy run gunner seat. It has happened. So I've been privy to that once before. But, you know, in that environment over there, you know, being mission focused on that, You know, those opportunities don't come around. But you know, coming back and getting the feedback from, you know, the pilot and from the gunner on how things are performing, make sure everything's ready to go. Occasionally, you know, we'd have incoming mortars that would come in, do tail strikes. We lost a couple helicopters while we were there, where the mortars would come in, and basically the shrapnel from the mortars would take out the tail boom section of the helicopter. And a lot of times that's where some of the electronics is stored. So that would wipe out systems and make that helicopter useless. And then we'd start scavenging parts to, you know, get another helicopter up and things of that nature. So that was a little more common than I was comfortable with.
Yeah, but so the threat was real.
Absolutely. I mean, our very first night coming in, you know, the very first night we were there, just getting settled into our cots and all that for the night, I was reading my Stephen King book for the evening.
What
and
book were you reading?
I was reading The Stand. And all of a sudden I started hearing these concussive booms, and I'm like, okay, what is that? We all had to come out of our tents, go hunker down in the bunker and all that. And then after everything was clear, we had to go assess the damage and, you know, see if there were any aircraft that were hit by those mortars coming in. So that was my welcome to Somalia at 10 o'clock at night as I'm getting ready to go to bed. Yeah, not quite. So
baptism of fire.
You got it. You got it. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night.
No, I can imagine. Did you ever have occasion to leave the base for any reason though?
So yeah, the way it was set up over there, we were at the airport. The Marine Corps actually held on to the university portion in town, is what we referred to as Alcatraz, just the way it was built, and kind of its own little island in town. It had basically concentric circles focusing on the main area in the middle. But we would go over there because that's where they also had some of the better PX services. You know, obviously it's limited at that time, but being able to go over and get shampoo and soap and, you know, cigarettes or whatever the case may be. You know, we had a few things like that we could go over there and get. They also had a hamburger joint over there where you could get a fresh grilled hamburger. Not sure if it was cow meat, but hey, whatever. It was still good, especially when you're eating MREs and you know, green eggs and ham every day.
From the air base.
Yeah, so they had shuttles running, Black Hawk shuttles, basically periodically from one section to the other.
You weren't ground.
Correct. So we didn't go ground. They pretty much had stopped all the ground operations after the Black Hawk Down incident, just because of there was still a lot of nuisances in town, and back then there was a lot of UN coordination, and interestingly enough, when I arrived in Somalia, I was handed my UN badge and my UN blue beret, but I was told that I would never wear them because we were no longer under UN coordination. My first thought, as you know, being a young PFC at the time, I'm like, why were we ever under UN coordination, and why would anybody ever wear the blue UN beret? That's my own thing.
Well, I gotta ask them, whatever happened to that blue UN beret? Did you get to keep it, or you had to
it was given to me. It was mine, but it ended up in the garbage.
You didn't keep it?
I had no intentions and no desire. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the shuttles were helicopter based.
Yeah, so we had shuttles that came back and forth, and it was pretty cool because they'd come out and fly over the ocean and come around, and
there was a little bit of a threat, I would imagine, still too, right?
Sure, certainly, and that's one of the reasons why they basically took the route that they did. We flew around town to avoid flying over any of the threat areas that are in the middle of town.
Well, so you mentioned the UN. So did you have any interaction with any other foreign militaries?
Yeah, so occasionally we would run into some Brits and Italians and stuff like that because they had their posts were also set up throughout areas around the airport. Everything really centered on the airport. That's where supplies came in. That's where the shipyard was, just south of there or just west of there. So everything was really kind of oriented around the airport. And so you had, in this backside, you had the Brits and the Italians and, and all that over there. And then we were on really the city side of the airport.
Well, so while you were there, how were you able to keep in touch with family and loved ones back in the United States?
Yeah, so for that, it was generally mail, snail mail. My grandmother, God bless her, she used to send me cookies all the time. And so she sent me cookies in Somalia. They arrived about 3 weeks after she sent them, which was actually pretty impressive, quite honestly. And they were still good because they're grandma's cookies, right?
So you were a popular guy.
Yeah, absolutely. But we also had, and the name of it blanks me, but they had the old the DSN phone.
Yeah, and like the Mars.
Yep. So you could call back to a local military base, and then they would connect you with, and so I would call back to Offutt Air Force Base, and they would connect me up to my mom and dad who lived in Council Bluffs. So it was a local call for the Air Force Base and do it that way. Ironically, my very first call, I was talking to them for about 5 minutes and the phone cut off. Needless to say, that makes mom nervous.
Yeah.
So she was in panic mode. I was not able to reach her for another week when the phones got set back up. So I tried to minimize those phone calls just to check in, say, yep, everything's good, still working, still looking at, another few months over here kind of thing. Just obviously just to let her know that all is good. Son's still alive.
No, yeah. I mean, that's the double-edged sword. You're making a free phone call, but you get cut off.
Correct. Correct.
Well, so it sounds like you were pretty busy, but did you have some free time? And if so, what did you do for like recreation or for fun?
Yeah, so we had some free time. Generally speaking, most of our missions were run during the day, and then as things started to wind down, we actually had a sand volleyball pit set up over there. We started a local. Basically, each shop had their own team. So the guns and weapons team, we set up our volleyball team, and we got our butts kicked in the finals of the volleyball tournament. But it was a good time, and the camaraderie of that, and being able to relax in an environment like that is critical. You got to reduce that stress.
And how was the chow? How was food?
Chow was. It provided sustenance. So, green eggs and ham pretty much every day for breakfast. Ate a lot of packaged oatmeal. MREs were available, but I mean, after so many MREs, you just can't eat MREs anymore.
So no, like, hot.
No, so I mentioned up at Alcatraz, they had that place where you could go get a hot burger, which was just something different. So when you did get an occasional day off or a couple hours off where you could catch a flight, I know a lot of guys that went up there and got an Alcatraz burger for sure.
Well, so we were talking about like off-duty time and communicating back home. Did your friend Nathan, was he deployed with you too?
Yep.
So you guys were still together?
Yep, still together. So and he and I were, the Cobra guys, because the guy from Fort Carson that was trained on Cobras, he was basically the platoon sergeant and the maintenance sergeant, because he was an E5, but he, Nathan, and myself were really the only ones that knew Cobras. Everybody else was an Apache guy. So we were really leading up a lot of the maintenance efforts that were going on.
Are you still in contact with Nathan today?
I am.
Yeah, good for you.
I am.
I was going to ask that at the end.
Yeah, he actually ended up becoming an Apache pilot.
Okay.
Went to Warrant Officer School, became an Apache pilot. So yeah, Nathan and I are still in touch.
Well, that's good. That's a good story.
Yep.
Right there. Well, thinking back to your time actually in Somalia or even getting there, are there any other incidents that stand out that were either like very scary or troublesome, or something funny happened? Just anecdotal stories.
I think really truly the funny thing was being in Fort Hood, being attached to the unit in Fort Carson. We were set on a timeline. We got to get ready because we got to get you out so you can mesh up with the unit that you're then going to deploy with. Well, our dates kept moving, and there was some uncertainty on, was it going to be December 16th or December 24th, or when are we going to move out? And then it literally came down to, okay, you're leaving tomorrow. You have to go get your shots. Well, anybody that's deployed knows that that's not just 1 or 2 shots. It's like 7 shots, and You know, you get your peanut butter shot in your butt with the, you know, all that. It's like, that's crazy. Then I had to hop on a plane, you know, and do all of that. So, you know, we were in military uniform on civilian aircraft, carrying our military weapons, and watching everybody kind of look at us like, okay, what's going on? But this was back in 93. This was before the time of, you know, September 11th and some of the fear factors that were going on with all of the airline travel. So it was just, okay, military guys on the airplane. A little different, but not scary. The stewardesses treated us pretty nice, though.
Yeah, I can believe that. As it should be, right? Well, so we mentioned Italians and Brits and probably some other countries. Did you ever have any interaction with local Somalis?
So very, very little. They did a lot of the, I'll say, the cleanup maintenance, you know, cleaning out porta-johns, cleaning out the showers, doing those kinds of things. That was, I mean, that's, and still to this day, that's still part of the natural deployment of things. You try to use some of the locals, win hearts and minds is still part of it, right? So we did have some of that. Was unfortunate sometimes where the locals weren't necessarily well liked by some of the militia members in town. Recall one morning that there was a guy sitting at the front gate with a sign hanging around his neck about this is what happens when you work on base.
Had he been killed?
Yes. Yeah. And so that's the reality for them, you know. And as a Somalian, you know, some of them wanted our help, some of them didn't. Some of them that wanted to work on base to make their life better and be able to, you know, provide something, i.e. food for their family, were getting threatened by some of the locals. So they had a lot of their own inner turmoil to deal with. But unfortunately, there wasn't much. We weren't really allowed to interact. And that's really what it boiled down to. We said hi to them. We seen them in passing. But that was really the crux of it.
And that's a great answer. I was just curious.
Yep.
Yeah, and almost, I know you know this, but for the interview purpose, I mean, I think maybe just take one step back. The overall mission for the U.S. into Somalia was to help the people. Right?
Correct.
It was humanitarian relief.
Yeah, and that all started under, you know, President Bush back in '92, and because of the things that were going on with the warlords over there, you know, we started, you know, we joined in with the UN humanitarian mission to deliver food and water and things of that nature, and then that ended up becoming, you know, not so much a military mission focus. We kind of got drawn into that military mission. And then we started seeking out using some of our special operators out of the 160th, where the whole Black Hawk Down incident kind of took place. You know, trying to go after some of those key warlords. And ironically, later in my, you know, aviation career, I actually ended up working on the Little Bird helicopters and the Black Hawk helicopters from the 160th, and got to meet some of those guys. So I've actually had a chance to meet Mike Durant, which is phenomenal. And for folks that don't know, or folks that have just seen the movie, he's actually the one that got captured and was taken hostage, POW, for some time. So had the pleasure of meeting and chatting with him and some of the other Black Hawk pilots that were involved in that mission. So certainly a unique experience and something I'm very grateful for.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, so as your time is now kind of winding down in Somalia, what was your return trip like? And tell us about your homecoming back to wherever you went back to.
Yeah, sure. So the return trip was different. I'd mentioned before the threat or concern that the militants in the area had acquired surface to air weapons. So we were actually shipped out. They ended up chartering a cruise ship from a Mediterranean company that came down, and we took a cruise from Somalia, Mogadishu, all the way down to Mombasa, Kenya. So got to cross the equator and do all that. As an Army guy living the Navy life, I wasn't real keen on it, but it was a cruise ship. It wasn't a Navy ship, so there was a swimming pool, but it wasn't really a relaxation time because, I mean, we had to run guard. We had guard duty. We had to make sure we were in pirate territory in that area. So,
and it was just you guys. There was no tourists.
Correct. It was just a military charter. So we had the Mediterranean girls that were working on the ship, but it was really truly just a place to rest, a place to get a shower, which was nice, versus the cold showers in Somalia. And then we got down to Mombasa. We sat on the ship for, I think it was like 12 or 24 hours before they could clear us to come off. And then we ended up unloading the ship onto trucks, trucked us up to the airport, and then we got on a civilian plane. If I remember right, it was World Airways. Flew into Egypt, flew into Shannon, Ireland, flew into Bangor, Maine, and flew back into Colorado. So the trip back had several more stops. So it wasn't a rush to get us home. It was a rush to get us over there. So that's why the trip back was pretty unique. And yeah. I was, of course, disappointed because landing in Ireland, being an Irishman, I'm like, I want to, let's take a 6-hour break. Let's just go check out the town. No, we were in the airport for a couple hours while they refueled, and off we went.
Not even time for a pint.
Nope, I don't. I really don't even qualify it that I've even been to Ireland, even though I've actually set foot on the airport grounds. It doesn't count for me.
You got to go back.
Yep,
was
absolutely.
Was there any kind of homecoming for you then into Fort Carson?
There was, with all the family, for all the people that were from Fort Carson, but I wasn't from Fort Carson, and my buddies weren't from Fort Carson. So our homecoming was, find me the nearest liquor store, give me a 12-pack of beer, let's just kick back and relax and all that, because we're heading down to Fort Hood tomorrow.
And were you single at the time?
And I was single at the time, so I didn't have family other than my mom and dad. I called my mom, let her know that I was stateside, everything's good.
Didn't get cut off.
Right, and didn't have to worry about getting cut off, absolutely.
And you were still with your buddy though?
Yep.
That's
yep.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, so then, how much longer did you stay in the military after that?
So after that is really truly when things started to shift for me. So I got back in February, March time frame. In May, I started having some issues medically, and my ability to perform my job started to dwindle. A year and a half later, Uncle Sam decided that my ability to do my job wasn't good enough and decided to medically discharge me. I don't know anybody in the military that spent any time in the military doesn't have back issues, right? Well, I was 20 years old when this all started, and I had a doctor that told me I have a perfectly healthy back if I was 80. So needless to say, my back issues were keeping me from doing the dominant portion of my job, which is lifting tool and lifting armored boxes and loading rounds on aircraft. That requires a lot of lifting, and unfortunately I wasn't able to do that any longer. So after that, I eventually ended up getting discharged in February of '96. So less than 4 years of total active duty time. But was able to land an opportunity with the contractor, continuing work on helicopters, just not in the armament role as much, although my armament experience certainly helped in being able to do some of the troubleshooting of systems and things of that nature. So that really provided me a benefit of, I was learning the electrical and avionics side as well, so expanding my horizons and using my leverage and training on the armament side to really, bolster my job opportunities. So I did that for a little while, and then ended up, going back to school to get an AMP license to try to expand my aviation, position as well. And then, just one thing led to another. Was just working contract jobs is really what I was doing for a while. September 11th happened. And after being out of the military just 5 years, I was ready to go back in, like I said before. But Uncle Sam in the military said that, still can't use me. So fortunately, that's when I landed a job in Kentucky in support of the 160th out of Fort Campbell. So being able to support the Night Stalkers on the Special Operations Group there, doing maintenance on their Little Bird helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters, doing modifications and upgrades, and getting to know those guys. And that was a unique experience, because we were modifying and upgrading these new helicopters that were in turn being deployed, like right away. Deployed to Iraq, deployed to Afghanistan. We actually had some that we had fixed and delivered to the customer that 2 months later were brought back for repairs because they had crashed or got shot at, and we got to see some of that. And unfortunately, we became friends with a few pilots that were test pilots that unfortunately deployed and didn't make it back. So it was a very humbling experience working with those guys, because those are the hardest chargers in the military as far as I'm concerned.
And I'd agree, but it sounds like from your service, the 4 or 5 years that you were in, you definitely had the qualifications, the credentials,
absolutely,
and the street credibility, so to speak, from
correct
your deployment. So
yep.
And you were still serving, just in a different
and that's the way I looked at it. And for me, it was about service, and it was about, if I can't serve my country in the military, I can serve my brothers and sisters as a contractor supporting their needs. And that's really what kept me in that military contracting world.
Well, and you kind of maybe have already answered part of this, but how do you think your wartime, your Somalia experience specifically, has affected the rest of your life?
So for me, really, truly, I look at it as a great perspective lesson. Understanding that when I went over there, like I mentioned before, I basically begged to go. Gung-ho, visions of grandeur in my 20-year-old head. But when I got over there and I got to see what it was like, and when you're flying over the city and you're flying over some of their shanty areas, it's a different life. And it's not something that I'd ever seen, certainly not in the United States. But I hadn't seen that. That lifestyle was completely foreign to me. But I also got to understand it a little bit about why it was going on, and understanding not the politics behind it, but the real purpose behind it. Because politics drives me nuts, and everybody's got their own opinion. But the purpose behind it, and seeing kids that are starving, standing on the other side of concertina wire, begging for food, it just gives you a new perspective, and really truly gives you a little bigger picture. Instead of being focused on what you know, it expands the aperture a little bit, and I think ultimately that has helped me immensely with just dealing with people and dealing with situations.
Well, I think that's well said. Well, let me ask you another kind of related question. So, looking at the big picture, and maybe down the road, if you have kids or grandkids or even great-grandchildren, if there's one thing you would want the future generations to know about you specifically in your military service, what would that be?
Ultimately, for my military service, I want them to know that I dealt with some hardships. I dealt with some uncertainty, but I did it with my chest out and pushing. I was trained on a helicopter that the Army was getting rid of. I was sent to a base that the Army was getting rid of. I was sent to deployed to a foreign mission that the Army was getting out of and transitioning away from. So it was all like, I'm not in the middle of anything big. It was always in the tail end, and it was always like, how do you overcome this new scenario, which is not what you were trained for, not what you were expecting, and certainly not what you want. but I loved it. I loved every minute of the military, and I say that faithfully. I had a lot of bad times in the military, but I loved every second of it. My buddy Nathan was a big help in that. Obviously, he and we were there in basic training together, AIT together, Somalia together, first duty station together. When I got out of the military, is shortly after that, he was transitioning to become a recruiter, but he and I were there. Families out of Tennessee, and when we were in Virginia going to school together, that was just a hop, skip, and a jump for him to just run down there and see family. So that was cool.
Those lifelong connections that you make through shared stress.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, we're down to the proverbial last question. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about or go back and revisit from your story?
I think the main thing for me is for people who don't get to experience the military deployment life or the military life at all. I didn't run into too many folks ever in the military that badmouth the military when it comes down to what we're doing on a mission. We're there to support. We're there to serve and do our job. After the fact, sure, I've said some things about my military service that, I think it was pretty piss poor that I went to Fort Polk, Louisiana when my unit was coming out of. But you know what? That happens. Nothing in life ever happens the way we expect it. So you got to learn to adapt. The Marine Corps thing is adapt and overcome. Well, that's a military thing, really, truly. And that's really, truly what it's about. But, for, the servicemen and women that actually, are provided the opportunity to deploy, particularly to, a combat area. To me, it's one of the most beautiful things to see, is because skin color, where you're from, none of that matters. It really doesn't even cross your mind at all. So, and to me, that's why I love every minute I was in the military, because it was a learning experience, because I got to meet cool people from all over the world, from all over the country, got to see some different places, and providing that perspective of the real diversity that's important is the diversity of experience, and that's what makes the military strong.
Yeah, I like that. And what kind of stood out talking to you this afternoon is you volunteered multiple times. And you volunteered to join the Army. Okay, that's great.
Yep.
But then you kind of stuck your hand up and said, hey, I'd like to get into the next level when you volunteered to go to Somalia.
Right.
Versus kind of hanging back, put yourself out there.
Yeah, there was an old rule that in basic training they say never volunteer twice.
Yeah.
Because they all volunteered once.
Right. Well, so, Eric, unless you've got anything else, I think we're...
No, I think that should be good.
I just shake your hand on camera here.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.